so we can get some questions. Bob DeLuca, Director of Grouper to East End. He is taking Fred Thiel's place. Fred said he's sorry he couldn't be here. He hopes to be at the next one.
I'm not nearly as funny either.
Well,
We're trying. Let's try.
going to be dealing with the the Community Preservation Fund and its importance and challenges.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the history. And first, let me just thank you for coming out. You know, those of us who work in land use planning, it really gets to be sort of complicated inside baseball if you're just hearing about this stuff by reading a little bit here and there in the paper or going to a couple of meetings. So any opportunity that you have to come out and listen to people that are involved in it, I think is great for everybody. For myself, I've been involved out here since about 1985 in one way or another, and I've been running Group for the East End since 1992. And before that, I worked with the Suffolk County Office of Ecology as a senior environmental analyst there, where basically what I did is looked at the environmental impacts of projects that were proposed all throughout Suffolk County. So, and I will tell you that if you think there are tough issues in East Hampton, Suffolk County has got plenty of its own. But let me talk a little bit about tools. And we heard before that, you know, planning tools are really important in what your community comes to look like. If you go back to 1977, 1978, there was an article in Newsweek magazine called The End of Eden. And it was sort of a post-apocalyptic picture of what might happen to the East End as the floodgates opened and as the East End was rolled over by development. That vision sort of in the late 70s corresponded very closely with a lot of what you've heard about the energy that was going into the better planning, better management of the resources that were here. When I showed up in 1984, 1985, East Hampton was kind of well on its way to starting to work through a series of zoning requirements that would help to protect the landscape, help to protect groundwater, reduce the overall potential density so that we weren't continuing to deposit as much human waste on top of our reservoir as we were or might have been, and to look toward the future of some of these resources. Now, at the time, I think that there was a general feeling that this was the right thing to do because of the people's understanding and value of fishing and recreation and tourism. You know, now we know a little bit more about the actual tangible numerical value of some of this open space. The state comptroller, and comptrollers are rarely seen as tree huggers, but the state comptroller had a nice report that came out this past year, just looking, you know, New York statewide at recreation and tourism being a $54 billion industry for the state of New York. Also agriculture, a $35 billion industry for the state of New York. And the other issue which engineers and highway department people and comptrollers are also looking at is what we call cost avoidance or green infrastructure. You know, every time you have to move water someplace in a developed community, it costs you money to build a pipe and it costs you money to maintain a pipe. And more communities are realizing, as East Hampton did many years ago, that the more open space you have, the less you have to pay for infrastructure and the less you have to pay to maintain it, which is one of the reasons, despite the fact that nobody likes to pay taxes, they tend to be lower in less developed areas because you don't have to have as many things that you have to fix, right? So one of the things that we now know is that the cost avoidance factor of protecting open space is more than just aesthetic, it's numerical, it's capital savings, and you should look at these assets as capital assets as well as aesthetic assets. There was an example given by the comptroller about a project, Charles River, Massachusetts, $100 million engineering project to deal with flooding if you went in and did all the traditional things that we do to move water around through classical engineering. If they purchased a bunch of wetland areas to allow that area to absorb this floodwater, it was a $10 million cost. Now the study was done by the Corps of Engineers, so let's assume they overestimated by 50% or so. You're still talking about a project that had a $50 million engineering cost, and let's say that they lowballed the wetlands cost. Even if it was $20 million, $30, $40, $50 million of savings that you never have to maintain is the kind of value that you get out of protecting these natural assets. Now, step back to East Hampton. Middle of the 1980s, toward the end of the 1980s, there were a number of projects, you've heard about some of them, where individual large blocks of land were coming up potentially for development. There was a lot of hustling around to try to find money to do some kind of a purchase. Those of us in the environmental community, elected officials, many folks concerned in the community were running around trying to get ballot referendums at $1 million here and a couple of $1 million here. And it became an annual pilgrimage to see how many different ways you could try to put another ballot initiative up to save one thing. And obviously, we were not able to keep up with the rate of expansive growth that was happening. So if you Put your finger in the dike over here, there were 5 more projects over there. About that same time, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, seeing the same kind of pressure, but having a much smaller geographic scale, looked at something called the land transfer tax, which is basically what we have now known as the Community Preservation Fund. Short story is, when you flip a piece of property, a portion of that sale goes into a fund. The fund is used to buy land. In our case, East Hampton started the trend in 1997 by adopting a local law that would have created a land tax for East Hampton. Upstate real estate interests and construction interests killed that bill. The governor vetoed it and gave us a laundry list of things that would be necessary to pass the bill, and one of them was you had to have more people signing on. So as opposed to crying about it, a lot of people worked very hard, including the town of East Hampton, a colleague of mine, Kevin McDonald, many folks, a coalition of roughly 200 organizations and individuals from around this region that included builders, developers, real estate people, conservationists, politicians. They actually could all agree on something. And what they could agree on was if you had a sustained source of revenue over time, there would be a lot more certainty in the outcome, and that's good for everybody. So back the region went and got a ballot initiative for a 5-town community preservation fund, which passed handily on the East End in 1998, went into effect in 1999. In the case of East Hampton, that passed by about 70%, very, very high numbers. Since that time, the bill has been reauthorized twice to provide for an extension of that program to go out further, to provide more money for land preservation. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's been approved about 69, 70% in East Hampton each time. I bring that up because oftentimes there's debate about who really wants to preserve open space, right? If you live here all the time, some people will put you in the camp and they'll say, well, you don't care about that. This is all the second homeowners and the tourist people. Only they like open space. The fact of the matter is local elections are a very good indicator as to what year-round populations want to see in their community. And East Hampton has scored essentially off the chart every time it's been given the opportunity to vote for land protection and open space protection. Those are numbers. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. Those are the factual numbers about the Community Preservation Fund, not only once but twice since. Now, how did it work for the town of East Hampton and then regionally? Well, the Community Preservation Fund is a great tool, and over the course of its existence on the East End, it's raised about $600 million for land protection. About half of that $600 million was raised by the town of Southampton, big town, a lot of activity there. About 30% of it, I believe, is in the town of East Hampton. East Hampton has raised roughly $200 million since the program started. It's saved about 1,600 acres, over 200 properties. If you go on, there's a website, which is a terrific website. It's ehland.org. If you want to really go through the town's program, you can see by hamlet what's been saved, the actual parcels, the justification for the purchase of those parcels. It's a real tribute to the people running the CPF program. So essentially, regionally, we've got about 10,000 acres saved by the Community Preservation Fund, 1,600 here in East Hampton. East Hampton annually represents a range of revenue from someplace around $10 million in the low range to a high in 2007 of $30 million. And I want to talk about that $30 million in a minute because as with all piles of money, there's a temptation with that money. But overall, the town has collected a tremendous amount of revenue to do a tremendous amount of good, and its neighboring towns have done the same thing. There's 10,000 acres of protected land that would not be protected without this fund all across the region, and it's the one tax when I bought a piece of property I was happy to pay. So now, in East Hampton's case, 2006, 2007, which was a very, very fast rate of growth in terms of land transactions, that fund got itself up to about $30 million. It was an astronomical, I can tell you being involved in this, that I think we assumed that this fund would probably raise $10 million a year across the region. As the housing bubble came in, it started generating more revenue. The downside was that the revenue was sort of like, every time you got more money, the prices went up. So we were kind of chasing our tail because the values kept going up, and you were sort of in the same place even though you had all this money. Now, East Hampton's gotten a bit of a black eye in the Community Preservation Fund, which many of you are aware of, and here's what happened. Essentially, if you're an elected official and everybody's screaming at you, you never want to raise taxes on anybody, and you see a pile of money sitting there, and you think to yourself, some of that money really could be used over here, and we wouldn't miss it so much because it's doing so well anyway, and it takes time to do all these things. So the town got too smart for its own good and decided that it could basically borrow some of this revenue, pay off some expenses, and arguably police had to drive by an open space parcel, so that kind of counts, and they got very creative in terms of the financing And it was a big screw up, and they got in big trouble for it, as they should have. And eventually, long story short, there was an investigation, people got arrested, the supervisor lost his job and left. And from my standpoint as a conservation advocate, I can't tell you how much this bugs me. Because we tell people to vote for something and we tell them to trust us, that this is a good program, and you can't predict what's going to happen down the line, although you wish that you could. In any case,
Just a clarification, no one was really arrested. We did wrong. I was on the board at the time. I apologize for not picking up on this. I was sick about it, I still am. But the town didn't decide to do that. The chief fiscal officer decided, and that was the supervisor.
Well, Ted House was arrested.
yeah. Got out.
But
Somebody goes out in handcuffs on the front page of the paper. It's a
But he
problem.
didn't, and look, I'm not defending him, okay? But it was not something that the town board at the time was aware of. And you can bet your bottom dollar, if I knew about it, it wouldn't have happened.
Well, bottom line, those of us who work to try to
But
get
it did
people to
happen.
pass these
I'm
things,
sorry.
you got to figure out what to do next, because I will tell you that I think this program is well worth having. And one of the things that happened was that the sponsors of this bill, Fred Thiel being one of them, Ken LaValle being the other, these are two great elected officials who we have been responsible for an awful lot of good things over a very long period of time. What they basically did is immediately put together a task force to start coming up with recommendations as to how we could tighten this law.
And the recommendations were?
Yeah, and basically the recommendations meant that you were going to have to tighten up where the money was going to come from, even though it was in the original legislation that you couldn't do inter-fund transfers. That was going to be more clear. You would have independent audits, basically all the kinds of things that you do to further stricture the ability of elected officials to basically get their arms around the money and do something else with it. Those, all of those changes were passed in state law, became part of the Community Preservation Fund law in ultimately in 2010. This task force kicked off, spent a period of time coming up with the recommendations. The recommendations got set in law, then they had to be passed. So right now, the Community Preservation Fund, as it exists, has tremendous amount of transparency, a tremendous amount of auditing, and a tremendous amount of additional scrutiny, as it should. It's also gotten a black eye, and the black eye that it has is it's very easy for people to say, well, you know, that was a nice idea, but people got in trouble for it, and maybe there's going to be more monkey business. So the future of this, you know, the end game here, if you care about the resources, we're going to have to do a couple of things with our Community Preservation Fund. And one of them is that we're going to have to start moving that fund to make purchases when the money is available, and there is money available in the town right now to do so. They closed the year, I think they're in the neighborhood of about $20 million, and this year they'll probably generate another 15 to 20 million more. And there is still land available. By the way, according to the town, the appraisals are coming in 30 to 40% less than they were in 2007. So for once, we have some money and the prices are at least slightly depressed, so we can do something about it and get moving on that program. It's also important that we start thinking forward about a lot of politicians. Suffolk County had something happen with its open space program at one point. And there's a tendency for all elected officials to not want to go near these things for a while. And I think the public needs to tell them, look, we know what the fund is for. We want to see it properly managed, and we want to see scrutiny. But we also want you to do the work of this fund and not let the money sit around idling for a very long period of time when we actually have a chance to still do some purchasing. So, you know, my closing comment is basically this. When a program suffers a setback like this, and it's a good program, two things have to happen. The first thing is you have to get in there and do some surgery and make sure it's much more difficult to mess it up the second time. The second thing you have to do is to remind those elected officials that you share the basic concern, but also the policy that was adopted 3 times in East Hampton is good policy and it makes sense, and to move forward with the program. The worst thing that could happen to this fund, other than what happened, is basically sitting on a pile of money and not spending it, only to watch sensitive, fragile land, which is the primary land that's getting bought with this money, disappear, and say, well, look at that pile of money. Now the town can't use it for general operations, and we're not using it to buy open space, so what was the point? So my homily basically ends with encouraging you to let your elected officials know that this is a fund that ought to be used, and it ought to be used properly. Don't stop using the fund because it's had problems. Use it more wisely, manage it more effectively, and keep the transparency and oversight.
What's your next target of purchasing?
Well, it's a good point. The town has a committee, and there's one of the reasons why this plan was attractive to people is it had a plan of many properties that are available for acquisition acquisition has to be voluntary, though. You can't just go and take it from somebody and tell them you're buying it up. They have to agree. So the town is constantly strategizing over a number of parcels that are in the community preservation fund project plan, which is actually on that website I mentioned. And you can see all these priorities. There are probably 8 to 10 projects where they're out looking at appraisals and negotiating at any particular time. So I don't know what's next on the town's list. As an advocate, my primary job has been to try to get the thing back on the rail and make sure the process is working better. And then, but you can check with the town. By the way, Scott Wilson, who runs the town's community preservation program, is a great guy and well-informed, and he can probably tell you what the top 3 projects are that he has coming in. And by the way, just one last point. It is hard for any politician over time to be courageous when the merits are not, in a media-driven world, as dynamic as they might be. And in the old days, you stood in front of a 300-acre piece of property and planted a flag and you did something and everybody said, boy, that's great. The pie is smaller and smaller, the pieces are smaller and smaller, and it takes just as much time to close on a half acre as it does on 200 acres. So we have to let our public officials know that this is still something we care about, or it's not front page news anymore if the town makes an acquisition because these pieces are smaller. But if you add them up, they're really no less important and they really do provide all of those values, and that's why we still think that the project is very worthy of support.
By the way, for those of you that have your own little land use map and can see this beautiful map that I purchased that's going in my hallway, the white is vacant land. Not much of it. Everything else is developed. So obviously, when you purchase open space, you're not going to purchase open space that has homes on it. So there's not many pieces left. However, Jeremy made a good point. They're at a low point now in their assessment. And every piece of this fragile puzzle counts. So it's time to crank it up again. There's been a real drop in purchases, and it's time to get back on the purchase train. Why? Does money come off the tax rolls when you buy open space? Who? Yes, Amy, you're right. She sat right up front, okay?
I'm not gonna get in trouble.
No, it does. That's what Jeannie said, that's it. The town owns it or the state owns it, and there's a little bit, but it's not much. However, the way that infrastructure is going now, and the cost to send kids to school, and the cost to truck out garbage, increased development, even if it's recycled, it still all goes up island. We're at the very tip here. The cost of having emergency services. I talked to the head of the Springs Fire Department. Those people make 700 calls this past year. They're volunteers. So how many more people can we have come out here? Seniors, second homeowners that have high-tech jobs to live and still provide those services for free. People cost money. Question: if those white vacant pieces get fully developed, is it going to help our tax base? And, well, it brings money in, but what else happens?
You spend a lot of money on the other side.
And you do. I mean, it's happened time and again.
Perhaps you spend.
Per what?
Take care of it.
Perhaps you spend money on the other side. So far, the things that I've been hearing are slanted. If people are buying a house as a second home, they're not putting money into, or children into the school system.
We
No, but they're
factored that
paying,
in.
but they're paying the
But they're
taxes.
paying for the school system.
Correct.
So what you're saying is only partially true.
Absolutely.
This is,
The best buy is open.
wait, this is for the next, there's gonna be just 5 more minutes here, okay? And then let's have that discussion, because a lot of people feel the way you do. And so keep asking that question. We have got to hurry this up.